Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I present a special edition of Central Booking with Connecticut resident Megan Collins, whose second novel, Behind the Red Door, was published in early August. I had the honor of interviewing Megan on behalf of Book Club on the Go, and the owner, Cindy, has kindly allowed me to use the recording from that event for my own purposes, which are pretty much on par with hers, to support the people who write books and read them, and to foster a sense of community. You'll have to forgive the pixelation. I couldn't see it in real time, and so no attempts were made to correct it. Of course, some would argue that's the preferred lens through which to view my face, and who am I to disagree? But I digress. I'd normally offer a longer introduction of Megan, whose accomplishments are quite impressive, but that's included in the clip, so you'll be hearing it shortly. All you really need to know is that she's a real up-and-comer, a true author to watch, and her delightfully disturbing new book will keep you turning pages late into the night. And let's face it, you'll probably be too terrified to sleep anyway. For people who don't know, this is Megan Collins, one of Connecticut's finest. It's always great to have local talent. So you received a BA in English and Creative Writing from Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts, an MFA in Creative Writing from Boston University, where you were also a teaching fellow. You teach creative writing, and you've been at the Greater Hartford Academy of the Arts and also Central Connecticut State University. You were the managing editor of the Three Elements Review, and you're just trying to make us all look bad. This is like nice credential after nice credential. You have been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and also twice, 2 times Best of the Net nominee. Your work has appeared in numerous print and online journals, including Off the Coast, Spillway, Tinderbox Poetry Journal, and Rattle. And your debut, The Winter Sister, which I know a lot of Cindy's customers love and recommend highly, was published in 2019 and was a Book of the Month selection. And Kirkus, who is notoriously snarky, they love your books. I mean, they gave you a great review. They said, in luminous lines aching with loss, debut novelist Collins deftly re-envisioned the Greek myth of Persephone, a bewitching thriller with surprises detonating in nearly every chapter. That's what we love to read. And you are now back, yay, with your second novel, Behind the Red Door, which is a great title and a great cover.
Thank you.
And that came out last week. And actually, I should say really quickly that for any technical difficulties we're having, last week you celebrated your book launch in a hurricane, in your car, in a cemetery, on your phone. So
this is nothing. This is great.
I know. You're like in a real place with books, and there aren't trees blowing behind your head. So you're doing awesome. So Behind the Red Door just came out last week, and Samantha Downing, who is the USA Today bestselling author of My Lovely Life, said, in Behind the Red Door, Meg Collins has achieved something remarkable, a dark, disturbing story that is both elegant and fascinating. Exquisite writing, compelling characters, and a story so captivating, I finished it in a weekend. Few books live up to the word chilling, but this one does. High praise. And Kirkus liked it as well. They said it was a tricky mystery. Even in the final pages, Collins avoids any unexpected resolution, leaving the reader deliciously unsettled and disturbed. A dark psychological thriller riddled with twisted family dynamics. Are there any other kind? I'm like looking, none of my family's really tuned in except for my wife and my mother, and I'm certainly not talking about them.
Right, of course.
No, of course not. If it all goes dark and there's a scream, you'll know why. But I thought I would start by asking you, a lot of us follow you on Twitter, and you're, very engaging and entertaining there, and you have a very small amount of space, 280 characters to sort of tell a story. So I thought, if you had to pitch Behind the Red Door in language fitting of a tweet, what would you say?
My standard pitch, I think, is tweet length. So it's a dark, twisty thriller about a woman who comes to believe that she has a that she has a connection to a decades-old kidnapping victim, and now that victim has gone missing again as an adult, she kind of starts a race around the clock or a race against time to figure out things from her own past to see if she can remember something and find out where that woman is now before it's too late. That would have been more than 280 characters.
It's probably pretty close, and we didn't even practice. I mean, I know you've had to give this spiel probably a dozen times, but that was good. I mean, if anybody out there was counting and they want to let us know whether or not that was 280 characters, but I'm giving you a pass because I was impressed. So before we get into the book specifically, and I don't want to spoil it, but I thought I would just start by asking you, this is your second published novel. And what was it about the idea? Do you remember the impetus for this book and why it was this idea that you decided you sort of wanted to be in a long-term relationship with? Because once you start writing a book, it is not a quick process. There's writing and revising and promoting and marketing, and oftentimes that can be almost up to 2 years.
Yeah.
So can you take us back to the genesis of this book?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I get a lot of ideas and I write them down, and sometimes I wake up with what I think is a great idea, and then I look at my notes in my phone the next day and it's just like, a woman goes to a cabin and something happens, and that's not helpful. But for this one, whoop, my book just crashed behind me. For this one, the idea started with this what if question. My ideas that stick around for a while for me are always this what if that really compels me. And it was, what if a person who had been famously kidnapped as a child then was abducted again and went missing as an adult? And what would the media coverage look like? What would the public's reaction be? Would there be as much fervor to try to find that person as an adult as there was when they were a child? And then, so I was really interested in that idea, and I was thinking, okay, so who is this story told by? Because if I'm telling it from the woman who's been abducted's perspective, then we already kind of know what is happening. So I came at it from this sideways angle with this character, Fern, who sees this story about the woman missing on the news, and she's with her husband, and her husband is like, oh yeah, that's Astrid Sullivan, famously kidnapped 20 years ago. And she's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never heard that. And he can't believe it. It would be like somebody not knowing, like the Elizabeth Smart case or something like that. So, but she's adamant. She's like, I've never heard that, but I'm looking at this woman's face and I know that I know her somehow. And so that really interested me. What would that mean? Why does she know her? And so from there, the story kept unraveling. And I always find that the stories that I can go the distance with are the ones that can act as sort of a giant metaphor for something I've either experienced or something I want to explore. And this one, there's a lot about fear in the book. Fern is a very fearful character. She has acute anxiety, and that kind of dictates all of her actions and her thoughts. She grew up with a father he's a psychologist, and he studies fear. So she's been immersed in fear her whole life. And so I wanted to explore my ideas about fear and what happens when we have a fear, but we know we still need to live kind of with it. And how do we do that? How do we keep going forward with something that we can't change, but that we're terrified of? Or how do we not even stop being terrified of it? Because I don't necessarily believe that you always just face your fears and then you're not scared of them anymore. But how do you face it and continue to face it? And so that was something I wanted to explore. That got me excited in the project. And then I was able to write the whole thing.
Awesome. Well, you covered a lot in that answer. I mean, I think that took care of like all my questions. So
Sorry.
I'm just kidding. But actually, I should mention, if anybody has questions of their own, there is a sidebar where you can type them in. So we will try to get back to those at the end. But I did want to ask you too a little bit more about Fern's experiences with anxiety. I know that you've been, very open about your own struggles with anxiety, and I think that even as a society, we're probably all a little bit more anxious now because there's just so much uncertainty in the world. So can you talk about, your experiences with anxiety and how you really wanted to explore not only the ways that affects a person, but the treatment options, and also sort of how you wanted to honor that struggle, both for people who will read this book and experience it every day, and for people who might not actually know what true anxiety feels like?
Yeah, so I think with any mental health issue, the best thing we can do about it as a society is just be open about it and talk about it as much as the person who's suffering from it is comfortable with. Because I think when it's made into this sort of stigma or this taboo thing, that's when people don't understand what it really is. And they might say, oh, you're depressed, like go take a walk, you'll feel better. Oh, you're anxious, you keep thinking about that, just don't. And that's not, if you're depressed or if you're an anxious person, like those things don't work. You can't just stop thinking about it. You just can't make yourself happier. And so it was really important to me to bring visibility to what it's like to experience anxiety on an everyday basis. And I mean, this is the way Fern experiences it is in a lot of ways the way I experience it. But I know that there's no like one size fits all with anxiety or depression or any other mental health issue, that everybody experiences it in their own way. But I could only bring kind of what I had experienced to the table, in the hopes that those who have experienced similar things might find comfort in that, might find like community in that in a weird way. And I wanted to, as much as I could in this dark psychological thriller, try to normalize that experience, that it's not something you should be embarrassed about. It's not something that we shouldn't talk about if somebody's willing to talk about it. And I've been really kind of blown away by how many people have reached out to me already to say that the anxiety aspect of the book really resonated with them, and that they hadn't seen their anxiety represented in a book this way before. So I'm really happy that that's how people are reacting so far. But then on the flip side of that, and I think this is interesting, I've seen some reader reviews where they get really annoyed by her anxiety. I've seen people call her a shaking leaf, that she has no backbone, that she can't, that she's just terrified of everything. And I just think it's really interesting, because I think that says something about how we view people who have really bad anxiety.
Sure.
And so like, I'm not mad about those reviews or anything. People are entitled to that opinion. But like I said, I just really want to try to normalize it as much as I could in this little 300-page space I'm allowed, and bring visibility to it.
Sure, and I think that nobody, would have expected how resonant that would be when you were writing this, a year and a half ago,
Right.
And here we are, and we're all like, yep,
Yep.
I can relate. But I wanted to ask you too, as you mentioned, the story sort of centers around two different women, Astrid, who went missing 20 years ago and reappeared 2 weeks later, only, with the emotional trauma of an abduction, but no real physical scars. And then 20 years later, she's written a memoir, Behind the Red Door. And she goes missing again, sort of 20 years later on the publication of her memoir. And Fern, sees this story on the news. She doesn't remember the name. She doesn't remember the story, but she starts to have dreams of Astrid, and then realizes that, she thinks that her dreams are actually true memories, and that she and Astrid have some connection. So can you talk a little bit about, your research into neuroscience and how the brain works, and how, our minds are able to manipulate themselves in dealing with a trauma like that? Because that's a really, I think, fascinating sort of thread that you pull throughout the book.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've always been really fascinated and scared of the idea of what our brains can do, and how they can shield us from things, and how they can just completely rewrite memories. And I've said this before, and I hope it's not insensitive to say this, but I feel like if you haven't experienced memory repression or anything like that, and then I always say, I don't think I have, I guess I wouldn't know, but if you haven't, and you haven't really looked into it too much, it kind of sounds almost like this science fiction-y thing. Like, do our brains really do that? Can you really forget something that could be this big experience in your life? But I did do a bunch of research into that in particular, and specifically looked at why it happens, and when it happens, does it just rewrite your memory right away? And when memories come back, do they always come back? What triggers them to come back? And so I did research into that. And the thing that I also wanted to play with, though, in this book is this idea, going back to the idea of anxiety. Anxiety so much is, it's like this constant lie in your head. It's telling you, this is the thing you need to focus on. This thing is bad. If you do this, this is going to happen. And then you're just hearing all these lies over and over. And so when Fern starts having these images or these dreams, and she's wondering, are these memories? Is this something that I've repressed, that I met this woman or whatever? she also has to wonder if that is just her brain lying to her. So either way, there's some sort of lie with the brain. Either the brain has jumped in to, for some reason, make her forget meeting this, she would have been a girl at the time, or her brain is coming in with its little anxiety tools and messing things up. And so I really wanted to play with that aspect a little bit about the different ways that our brain lies to us. And sometimes it's for protection, and sometimes I don't know why it happens. It's just wired that way.
Sure, sure. And, I wanted to ask you too. So once Fern does become convinced that this is something real, and she does have memories of Astrid versus just visions or dreams, she actually, she's supposedly going to help her father pack up his house. He needs her help. And she decides, all right, I'm really close to where Astrid was abducted the first time and where she disappeared from again. So I'm going to start to visit the people and places that are somehow connected to her abductions. So can you talk about one, how that sort of lends itself to a heightening of suspense, but also, how she's able to use those people and places as a trigger to recall some of those lost memories?
Yeah, so that was both of those things you mentioned are kind of why I built in the memoir excerpts into the book and have that sort of woven in. So you're seeing Astrid's story of being kidnapped and the time around that interspersed with Fern's story. And so I wanted her to have a chance to delve into Astrid's story as a way to try to trigger whatever might be going on with her. But also on the suspense side, I worked really hard to kind of juxtapose the memoir excerpts with things that would either kind of rub up against something that Fern had just discovered, and to be like, okay, maybe that wasn't actually true how it was, or to just show an interesting contrast between these two women's lives or these two childhoods that they had, and how they both led them to these experiences where they felt sort of oppressed by their parents, even if they didn't put it in those terms, but for very different reasons. And so I wanted the last thing I wanted to do was make the memoir chapters feel like a burden for the reader to have to get through, because I know sometimes if you're reading a book and then it jumps away from the perspective you're really involved in, it can kind of be like, oh, but I want to keep reading that other thing. So I didn't want that to happen. So I wanted Astrid to also have this story that's developing, that is working both as clues for Fern and working as kind of contradictory information sometimes. Like there's one character that she visits from the book and she talks to, and that person gives kind of a completely different take on what happened than what Astrid says in her book. But then there's sort of an interesting there too, because Astrid, we know, has written this memoir. And so in that, she's taken control of the narrative. So just like Fern is a little unreliable in the sense that what is her brain doing? What has it done? And the anxiety that continues to impact her. We don't know if what Astrid's saying is reliable too, or if it's exaggerated or whatever. So my hope is that people are just as invested in the memoir chapters as they are in the Fern chapters.
Sure, and I have to say, I read a lot in this genre, and I think that was very well done, because I think the customary thing that people tend to do is it's, one chapter in the present day and another chapter in the past, and they alternate that way all throughout the narrative. And you're right, you can lose sort of that narrative momentum and that connection with a character, but that's not the case, with your book. I mean, there will be several chapters at a time in Fern's, perspective and her present day experiences, and then you have a couple pages thrown in that reveal a bit of the backstory. And I did want to ask you, because I know that you touched upon the fact that that was something that you were very cognizant of. And I know that you are very much a plotter and not a pantser. So Can you talk about how that became part of your creative process as you were mapping out the book before you even sat down to write chapter after chapter?
Yeah. In terms of plotting the whole thing, or specifically plotting where the memoir goes? or both?
Maybe just in thinking first about, how you're going to intersperse the memoir without it really being, a diversion from
Yeah.
Fern's story. And then if you want to address that more, more broadly, I'm sure people would find that interesting because it is that whole debate over plotters, pantsers,
Yeah.
and
So for the first time in my writing process with this book, I used note cards. I know that a lot of writers do that to plot things out, but that's never really been my process. And it hasn't been since then. But there was something about this story that was kind of calling me to that. And I think it was this figuring out, where do these memoir chapters go? So I had these orange and green note cards. And on the orange ones, I put, each note card was a different Fern chapter and I just put down what's happening. And then on each, whatever the other color was, I put what is happening in Astrid's chapter. So then I laid out all the Fern chapters on the floor so I could see them and visualize them. And then I started to play with putting the Astrid cards in between different places and thinking about how would this juxtapose against what Fern has just discovered or what she's worried about or whatever's happening there. And then when I had what I thought felt like a pretty cohesive narrative between both of those stories, that's when I kind of committed to it in a way and sort of writing the plot, not on note cards, but in a traditional outline. So that's how I did that.
yeah, and I think you must have done pretty well because I actually found myself, anticipating those memoir chapters and hoping for them. And
Oh,
usually my
good.
experience is kind of the exact opposite. Like, oh, let me just get through this and back to the story. But I wanted to ask you too, at the beginning when I was reading some of the praise, of your books, there were a couple of mentions of sort of twisted family dynamics. And I did want to ask you about those dynamics because, Fern has a very interesting relationship with her parents, but I don't know if this was intentional or not, but Astrid as well
Yeah.
has a very interesting relationship with her parents, and they're kind of polar opposites. And so you would think maybe one of those characters would be more happy, with their parents
Yeah.
than the other, and that didn't turn out to be the case. So, and I should tell you, after you talk about these weird little dynamics, I will ask you to extol the virtues of your own parents who you dedicated the book to, so that they don't think that, so people don't think it's anything to have to do with them.
They'll appreciate that. Yeah, so I definitely wanted Fern and Astrid to have kind of opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to the parents that they have. And so Fern has these parents who mostly neglected her for their own work, and they were obsessed with their work. Her mother, Mara, is an artist, so she's always spending time in her studio. Her father, as I mentioned, is a psychologist, and he's working on his research and stuff. And then Astrid, on the other hand, she has parents who are kind of overly involved with her life and overly involved with the way that they think her life should be and what she can and cannot do. And a lot of that comes from their religious beliefs. They're very strictly Catholic, which is to say nothing bad about Catholics. That's just how they were in the story. So I'm very interested. I talk about this a lot in interviews. I'm very interested in the idea of a bad parent and what a bad parent looks like and how many ways there are to be a bad parent. And my interest in that comes from how societally we have such high expectations for parents, particularly mothers, I think. But in this book, obviously, I was focusing more on her father. And so I always just like to push against that and see what it looks like to go in the opposite direction. Plus, it makes for more interesting, messed up adult characters once they've grown up. And I'm just really interested in how a person's childhood shapes who they become. And so in The Winter Sister 2, my debut, there's a very fraught relationship, mother-daughter relationship, very complicated. A lot of people hate the mother in that book, just as a lot of people hate the father in this book, which I don't blame anybody. Like, they're not meant to be good parents at all. And I really wanted Fern to be in this situation where she's needing a father, a parent, to be a good parent more than ever, because she's in this kind of harrowing experience where she doesn't know what's real. She doesn't know what's really even going on. but when she needs her father the most now, he's still not there for her. And she thought things would be different. He's retired. He's not working. Now I'm finally going to have that relationship with my father. And he's still just as obsessed as always with this idea of he wants to best his he calls him his fremesis, Brennan Llewellyn, who's like this top psychologist in their field that he went to grad school with. So he's still in that obsession, and she is just still not getting that support she needed. In a lot of ways, like Astrid was not getting the support she needed. So I was interested in having those two wildly different upbringings and seeing how it still created similar feelings in those characters. And now to answer your other question, no, these parents are nothing like my parents. I think they're watching now, and that's not the only reason I'm saying that. I did dedicate the book to them, kind of because I anticipated a lot of people being like, who are these girls' parents that she's writing this stuff? But they're great. They always go into super PR mode for my books and try to get everybody to buy them. They're extremely supportive. So they are not Ted and Mara at all.
Well, that's a relief. We're all very happy. Oh, Cindy's reminding us, if you have any questions, you can drop them in that little question box and we will get back to those. If not, I can keep talking to you all day. But I did want to ask you a little bit more specifically about Ted too, because you mentioned Ted is Fern's father. And, and you mentioned that he's sort of been negligent of her. He's very consumed with his work. When she was a child, he did a lot of fear experiments with her and sort of used her as his guinea pig. And yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about his past with his father, because in his eyes, his father had a very different public face than his private face. And so people thought he was this great guy when really he terrorized Ted and his mother, was physically abusive, emotionally abusive. And just because, Ted doesn't put his hands on Fern, he thinks that he's this great dad. So can you talk a little bit about how you build that dynamic throughout the book by giving us sort of insights into his own childhood?
Yeah, well, I wanted to make sure that he wasn't just this like one-dimensional bad dad, that like we also see where his upbringing has brought him to the point he's at, and why he's super competitive and why he does some of the things he does. And I think it's, there's that old thing, hurt people. And so he definitely experienced a lot of pain in his life. But I also think that a lot of times those hurt people don't see the damage they're doing because it doesn't look like the damage that was done to them. And so he's saying to Fern, he says a lot to her, like anytime she expresses any kind of like, I don't know, distrust in his parenting, he says, I never laid a hand on you. I never did this. I never did that. My father did this and that. And so he thinks that because he never physically abused her, he's been an okay dad to her, because he didn't really have an opportunity to see even what like a good father is supposed to be. He just knew what a very bad father was. And so he thinks, since I'm not doing that, I must not be a bad father. And he doesn't get that you still need emotional support. You still need connection and affection and all those things. And so that I was really interested in that side of his character. And also the ways he could basically justify anything that he does. He's like, he just thinks he's so great, which I hate him. I hate about him, but I also love about him because it was so fun to write.
Sure. It's that character you hate to love or love to hate, whatever it is, but it keeps you turning pages. So I'm going to move away from this book in a minute just because I don't want to spoil anything. But before we move on to more general questions, and I do see that we have a couple in the sidebar that we will get back to, but I wanted to ask you about setting and how you use that to build atmosphere, because you are a New Englander, and this book really, takes part in New Hampshire and Maine, and there's little bits in Boston, and there's creepy woods and weird houses, and it really, I think, elevates the story. So can you talk about how your experience is as somebody from or around that area, how you're able to draw that into creating the backdrop for this work?
Yeah, well, I've always I grew up in a small town, very small town. My high school class, we had like 53 people in it. So I feel like I know small towns pretty intimately, and they're very interesting to me. And I think that they're great fodder for tension and kind of some creepy things, and everybody knowing your business, which is creepy. And so I just kind of wanted to take that to the max in this book, in that when Fern gets to her hometown, she mentions that there's basically no cell reception there. And so immediately it's sort of like she's cut off from the rest of the world. She can barely even get on the internet. Her father doesn't have Wi-Fi because he's all about using typewriters like I have in the background here. So she's extremely cut off, and the woods are surrounding her home. She's always been kind of creeped out by these woods and haunted by them for various reasons. And I think, I think woods are beautiful, but I also think I don't want to be alone in them at any time, in the dark or in the light. So I just kind of like packed in there a bunch of things that I find creepy in a New England town. So I had the woods, I had the spotty cell reception, which is definitely true. And I think a lot of small towns that I've been to in New England, and the fact that everybody knows who you are, and that can be a comfort, but that can also be kind of claustrophobic. So I love creating settings like that. I love, I've said before that I can't really authentically create a setting that isn't New England, because I've never lived anywhere other than New England. Like, I've been to places for a week or so, but it's not enough to, I feel, really hone in on those details. So yeah.
Sure, I totally get that, because, the woods creep me out. Like, there's nothing more terrifying to me than the thought of like poison ivy, sumac, oak. Like, I would probably rather you chase me with a machete than like be thrown into a bush with poison ivy, but that's my issue. Anyway, so I'm going to move away from this book and ask you a little bit about your background, and what you do beyond writing fiction, if you don't mind. And I see that this is going to be on par with some of the questions that we're getting. Somebody said, obviously, you're educated in creative writing. Yes, you are, because we're going to talk about that. But before we get to that point, I did want to ask you, in thinking back, what do you credit for having this love of storytelling? And can you talk a little bit about how your reading life has influenced the kind of books that you now write?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't like say one thing made me get the idea to start writing, because like one of my earliest memories is I was 6 years old and I wrote this story, and I was just like, oh, that's what it is. That's the thing I want to do. And I don't want anything else. And that's kind of been my viewpoint my whole life. I knew I would have to do something else, because it's not the most practical thing to just be like, I'm going to be an author and then expect to be fine and make a living. So I feel like it's always been a part of me, and I don't know where that came from. But in terms of my reading life, when I was little, I would read, like, of course, Nancy Drew mysteries, a lot of like the creepy stuff, like Christopher Pike, R.L. Stein.
Oh, yeah.
I was obsessed with those, reading those all the time. And then for a long time, my reading kind of leaned more towards the literary side of things. Toni Morrison is a huge author for me. I love her so much. And so I was reading mostly literary fiction. But then I think once I started writing The Winter Sister, I was like, okay, there's obviously a mystery element here. And so I wanted to read what else was out there in that vein, which is so much. So I asked my agent, like, what kinds of things should I be reading right now? And she introduced me to Tana French, who now is one of my favorite authors. And so it was kind of strange to me. I always thought I would kind of write this very like straight up literary novel. And then when I wrote what became this psychological suspense, I was sort of like, okay, that's not what I was planning. But then when I think back to that question of like, what was my early reading like? As a kid, all I did was read these mysteries. So it makes sense that that was sort of always embedded in me and just kind of waiting for the right story to come out.
Sure. And at the beginning, we spoke briefly of your education, and you did study creative writing. You do have your MFA. So I'm going to ask you about teaching in a minute because you do that as well. But first, I know a lot of people who study writing say that it can be sort of a double-edged sword, and there's ways that it can help you, there's ways that it can hinder you. So can you talk about your education and those things, what you found to be the most helpful in terms of your progression, but also the things that may have been a hindrance to you moving forward, like, perhaps losing your voice or stifling of your creativity. I'm not saying that happened. I've just heard from other people that occasionally that does. So what's your take on that? Another great debate.
Yeah. So with my MFA, I actually went for poetry and not fiction because at the time I was much more not into, but that's just what I was writing more, even though I knew that I wanted to write a novel, but I went for poetry. And I'm really glad that I did because it kind of trained me in noticing and really appreciating sort of the sonic textures of things. What is the cadence of the piece? How do you add in these layers of sound? And of course, I think that poetry is a great background for any kind of writer. But I think that one of the things that was kind of a hindrance in that program in particular, it got a little competitive in the workshop space with some of the people. If you weren't writing the type of poetry that they wrote, for example, like really formal metrical poetry, then they kind of were just like, what is this? And I really hated that attitude. Like, we can all just write our own things. And so in my teaching life, when I teach workshops, that is something I try very hard to make sure does not happen. We're not here to judge anybody, and everybody has their own voice and style. So I'm really glad that I did do the MFA because I think it just made my voice as a poet come alive more. And then that helped me immeasurably in being a fiction writer because I love also paying attention to the language in prose, not just like the story that's being told.
Sure. And it's funny you would say that about poetry and how people view it. And that's funny because whenever I write anything like that, I call it lyrics. And then I'm like, nobody's going to judge me on poetry. But I wanted to ask you too, you mentioned poetry, you've done short fiction, now you're writing full length novels. Do you have a preference between short form and long form works? And how are they similar to each other and how do they differ since you've now done both?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not that I have a preference. It's just now I'm so on this track of writing novels and it doesn't leave a lot of time for writing poems or short pieces. And that's okay. I think that if I was called to write a poem, if I had an idea, I could still sit down and work with it. But I think the ways that they're similar is that whether it's a novel or a poem, there's some story that you're telling. And a lot of times people don't think of poems as also being stories because they're not necessarily narrative, but they are. You're relaying an experience, you're relaying a moment, a feeling, whatever it is. And so I think that they're similar in that way. You have to be able to make somebody continue reading paragraph to paragraph or line to line, and you have to keep their interest. And the thing for me anyway, the way I feel about poetry versus fiction, writing it, I feel like, when I finish writing a novel, it feels like an immense accomplishment because it's so many pages, it's so many words. So it usually feels like more of an accomplishment than writing a poem. It's not necessarily like I don't want to put value on one over the other. It's just a different thing altogether. But the sort of high, the writer's high that I get when writing a poem is so different from writing fiction. I think because with fiction, it takes so long. You're in that novel for so long. But with the poem, even though poems can take a really long time and you can come back to them again and again until you finally get it right, there feels like there's more of an instant gratification with it. And so for me, that's the difference in feeling with writing the two. But at the same time, writing fiction and writing a novel, you get to be so immersed in it and create like a whole world and all these people that didn't exist before that then become really real to you. So they're all great.
That's a good point, though. There is no instant gratification in novel writing.
Yeah.
So I am going to ask you a little bit about your teaching, and I see that somebody wanted to ask you where you work. I'm not sure if you're comfortable answering that or not, but if not, we can always Google that after the show.
Yeah.
But I keep asking you about these great debates, whether it's plotters versus pantsers, or whether or not people should be formally educated to write. But in your opinion, you've been doing this a while now, so let me ask you, what do you think of writing can be taught versus what is intrinsic, and how does discipline or tenacity kind of factor into that equation for students?
I think it can. I mean, it's not necessarily that you're teaching someone how to write. It's that you're giving them the tools to improve the work that they are already doing. And I can teach you poetic devices. I can teach you story structure. I can teach you plot development and all that. But it really comes from the student's own raw material and then building on that. And I can show you how to improve that. And not just me, like a group of writers. So I forgot what the first part of that question was.
So I think my question was, what can you teach versus what you can't? Because a lot of people say, you can teach the fundamentals, you can teach grammar and syntax and all that stuff, but you can't necessarily teach voice. But also, some people just seem to have more discipline, more tenacity. They keep at it. They don't give up. So how can that really help in terms of success? And when I say success, I mean, eventual publication.
Yeah, I think tenacity is a huge part of it. Whether you are the most talented writer in the world or whether you're still figuring out your voice. No matter who you are, you're going to get rejected. That's just part of it. And so to just keep with it, even when it's hard, is a really hard thing to do. But it's something that I try to model for my students by being honest with them about my own past history of trying to get published and how there were a lot of rejections along the way, and you just have to keep going. But I mean, I think about, I've had a lot of students who, when I first started working with them, they had, they hadn't really developed their voice yet. And then a couple years later, they're writing these pieces that just blow me away. So I think a lot of it is being exposed to certain writers and being exposed to those writers as teachers and using them as models. And I think it's also having, like my students have had a room full of their peers always to give them feedback and to, again, just try to help them improve upon where they're already at. So it's never about like, this person's here, this person's here, this person's here with talent. It's like, we're all just trying to go this way, wherever we are. And so I think as long as you want to do it and you want to put in that hard work, you're going to get somewhere. You're going to improve from where you were.
Sure. And if I understand correctly, you work with younger students, right? So teenagers,
Yep,
that sort of age, impressionable minds. But I wanted to ask you too, and you sort of mentioned this a little bit in your last answer, but it must be really interesting to be experiencing sort of the growth and the progression of your own career with these students who are watching it with you and, sort of growing along with you and supporting you. So can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, my students have supported me so much, like in a completely adorable, loving way. I've had students come to my book events. I've had students, when The Winter Sister first came out, there were a few students who were reading it in their classes, which I'm not saying is an okay thing to do. They should be paying attention to their work. They were reading it in their classes. They were going through the hallways, yelling things at each other about the plot that they were like, about. And like, it just felt so great to have that support from them. And I had a former student who drove 2 hours for my book launch for The Winter Sister, which was like, I mean, who does that? It's so amazing. So I love my students, former and current, and it's so awesome to get to share this journey with them, because a lot of them, like they say, like, that's what I want. I want to publish books. Like, how do I do that? They say very cutely, how do I be you? And I was like, don't be me, be you. And again, I just tell them, like, you just have to keep working at it. You just have to keep pushing. and you're going to get a lot of no's, and you have to be okay with that, even though it's going to hurt and it's going to be disappointing. So yeah, I wrote about my students a little bit in the acknowledgments of Behind the Red Door, just because I'm so thankful for the ways that, like, it boggles my mind that these teenagers who have like no money somehow put together like $25 to go buy my book. And like, that means so much to me.
Sure.
I don't know. So I love them.
That's pretty awesome. And, to have a former student drive 2 hours, it's not even like she's going to get brownie points because she's a
Right.
former student, but that's awesome. And talking about buying books, again, I'm going to remind people that you can click this little button that says buy now, and you can get a signed book plate from Megan Collins. So interesting question that I saw a little bit ago in the sidebar. We talked a little bit about your writing and how you've written poetry. You don't just write mysteries. I mean, even when you were writing The Winter Sister, you didn't necessarily realize that it was going to be any kind of genre book. So I'm assuming this person means in your future novel writing, do you anticipate that maybe you'll, try a different genre at some point other than mystery, suspense, thriller?
I mean, the thing is, I think my publisher would say I should not do that because
You're right.
once you get a readership and you're trying to build a readership, it doesn't make a lot of sense to switch to something else. At the same time, I'm not ruling it out. I mean, right now I'm really drawn to writing these dark thrillers, and I'm loving that. But I also, like, sometimes I get these ideas for rom-coms that I'm just like, where'd that come from? So sometimes I'd really like to explore that, something lighter. But then I feel like if I started writing that, I'd just end up really dark in a weird way, and then I wouldn't know what I have on my hands.
It would just be a tragic comedy or something.
Yeah. So I'm really happy writing in the genre that I am. I'm not going to say like, no, I'll never write in anything else, because I don't know. But right now I'm happy with this.
Sure, and Cindy is sending us hearts, so that must mean we're doing an okay job. Awesome. Somebody else wanted to know, can you imagine your book becoming a made-for-TV movie or being adapted for the big screen? Have you ever thought about that? Do you ever think about who might play these characters?
I mean, I'd love that. That would be amazing. I think
It's
every
every
writer would
author's
love
dream,
that.
right?
Yeah. I know that a lot of writers do kind of cast their books in their head. I don't really do that. Sometimes I kind of get a feeling about one character or something. When I was thinking about what would happen if this was made into something, who could play Fern, because Fern is described often as being very small and very like skinny, and often confused for students sometimes in the school that she works in, which that has happened to me many times before. So I was like, who is very small? And so I kind of thought Anna Kendrick would be a good Fern. And then there is a really great bookstagrammer on Instagram, Gare Indeed Reads, who casts all the books that he reads, and that's how he reviews. And so he did a casting for Behind the Red Door, and he also cast Anna Kendrick as Fern. So I was like, well, that just does it then.
Hello, Hollywood.
Yeah. And so he did that. He also did one for The Winter Sister, and I thought I did a great job. But for the most part, I don't usually think about it. I feel like, because if I start thinking about that, then I'll just be like, go down this spiral of, well, why isn't that happening? Why aren't I on TV?
Right? Where's my money for the options?
Right. Exactly.
Like, at this point, you don't even need to get it made into the movie. If someone options it, you're a step ahead because there will be a paycheck. But
Right.
Let's see. So I guess back to sort of the education question. I think somebody wanted to know if you think you would be the author that you are today without having that formal education.
I don't think I would. I think I learned so much, like both in my undergrad and graduate work. I just learned so much from other writers. And I think that is really the most valuable part of having or going to get an MFA or studying writing in college, is being in a community of writers. And so it's not necessarily about who's teaching you, although I've had an opportunity to work with some really amazing writers. But it's really about meeting other writers, getting to have writer friends, talking about the craft, supporting each other. And like I said, sometimes in my grad school experience, it wasn't always the most supportive, but I did have a group in there that we definitely were supportive of each other. But I think it's about getting the experience, hearing other voices, critiquing other voices, because I tell my students this all the time, that giving feedback to somebody is just as valuable as getting feedback, because in giving feedback, you're honing your own skills. You're figuring out what works for you and what doesn't work for you and why. So yeah, I do think it's valuable. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think somebody has to have a formal education to be a writer. Just for me, where I grew up and where I went to high school and stuff, I didn't have any friends who were writers. So it was an invaluable experience to be able to meet other people and just like understand this like weird thing that we do where we go to our computers and just make stuff up. So I think it was a great experience.
Sure. And it's funny because people who don't write, hear you're an author or writer and they think that that's very glamorous. And the truth is you're basically a recluse, a shut-in,
Yep.
except for when you have to go and teach and do your other job.
Yeah.
But really, we've just been planning for the pandemic for all these years because we're kind of used to being shut up with our computers. But I did want to ask you too, and I always find this interesting. I think that one of the reasons I gravitate away from writing a lot of fiction is because then I find that I don't have a lot of time to read. And I know that when you were younger, you were a big time reader. Do you find, that you miss that reading time, that you don't have as much as you used to? And, how do you balance that out? Because, well, you have some novels to your credit. I probably never will. And I'll be like, well, I read 100 books.
Yeah, no, I still read a fair amount, I think, when I'm writing. And I used to not really. The first couple novels I wrote, which didn't end up getting published, I wasn't really reading at the same time that I was writing them. But then I don't really know why. I think reading just came back into my life in a big way again. And so when I've been writing the last 3 books that I've been working on, reading is still something I do at night after I've done my writing for the day. And it's really important because I think it keeps me continually inspired. And then in particular, reading thrillers that are out there, it helps me to be aware about what's already in the market, and so that I don't accidentally steal someone's idea or something. So I still definitely read a lot, and it's how I continue to go to school, so to speak, for writing, by learning from these other writers.
So do you sleep?
I do somehow sleep. I don't know, it's kind of, I guess I don't have kids, so that's something that I don't have that time taken up. I have a dog though, who I treat like a child. But yeah, that's somehow it all happens.
Sure. So do you have any advice for, work-life balance for people who have maybe creative ambitions that aren't on par with what they're doing currently? Because, as you said, you teach, you write, you edit, you read, you even sleep occasionally, and somehow you manage to fit it all in. So what advice would you give to other people who are trying to find some kind of balance?
So I think it's all about setting really manageable goals for yourself and being kind to yourself when you don't meet those goals. When things come in your way from regular life, that means you don't get to write that day. I think there's this tendency to feel really guilty about that when you don't write or you don't meet your goal. But I think you have to remember you're also a human. And right now, for everybody, you're a human going through a pandemic. And that has a whole other set of challenges. So yeah, I think it's about setting manageable goals. Even for myself, my own writing routine, I write in the mornings when I'm teaching for like a couple hours, and I set a goal every day of 500 words. Because to me, I'm like, okay, I can write 500 words. Even if they're not great 500 words, I can get to that point. So then whenever I write more than 500 words, which is usually most of the time, I just feel like, oh man, I just nailed it today because I did more than my goal. So even if your goal is only like 200 words, that's fine too. Just set a goal and then make it as manageable as possible. And then if you exceed it, you get to feel amazing.
And I think that's great because people can actually look at you and see a success story and say, wow, that actually works, because here you are, 2 years, 2 books. So write 500 words a day and see what happens.
Yeah.
All right, I am going to start to bring this to a close because we've been going for almost an hour, but there are a couple of questions that I've purposely been ignoring, so I hope nobody took it personally, but this just seems like the time to ask them because a couple of people have asked for a teaser of what you're working on now, and one person specifically asked what your favorite true crime and or abduction story is, and I feel that that might sort of lend itself to the book that you're working on
Yes.
now, so take it away.
Okay, so the book that I'm working on now is right now called The Family Plot. In publishing, titles change, so I don't know if it will, but it's called The Family Plot, and it's about a true crime obsessed family that gathers together to bury their father, coming back to their childhood home. They're all adults now. And when they go to dig up his burial plot, they find the body of their long missing brother already there. And so it's a lot of family drama and dysfunction and more creepiness and all of that stuff that I love. And so I love true crime, as you can guess from what I write and from that book description in particular. And that book that I'm working on, it really investigates why we're drawn to true crime and how true crime can be both like a source of comfort in a weird way and kind of dangerous in a weird way as well, too, when you kind of oversaturate yourself with it. But my favorite, I think the story that got me into true crime was the West Memphis 3 and the Paradise Lost documentaries on HBO. That's when I was really like, oh, I like this, even though it's horrible. So those are great. I'm a huge fan of the My Favorite Murder podcast, which is because then for anybody who doesn't know it, you get 2 different murder stories each week. And I also, I don't know if I have a favorite abduction story, which is weird given the book I just wrote. But yeah.
Say, how about yours? Behind the Red Door is a
yes,
great abduction
that's
story.
my favorite abduction story, which you can buy with the green button that says buy now.
That's right. I think we've totally come full circle. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about before we invite Cindy back in, hopefully?
No, I just want to say thank you so much. You've been so great. I love these questions, and thank you for reading my book so thoughtfully. This was awesome.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It was a great book, so that's always
thank you.
a joy. It's like going down the rabbit hole, and then it's like, oh, I got to come out and see people virtually for a little bit. All right, let's see. Oh, and Cindy's asking, what states are we all from? Well, we're in Connecticut. I don't know about anybody else. All right. Yep. A couple more Connecticut people. No surprise there. Hey, Ohio.
Ohio is one of my former students, Colleen.
Awesome.
And I saw another one of my former students, Winnell, in here too. Thank you, former students.
Oh, yeah. Winnell had some great questions.
Yeah.
I didn't want to mispronounce your name, so I didn't say it, but there you go. Oh, Penny. One of our favorite writers is here. Hi, Penny. All right. More CT people. Yep, Penny says hey back.
Okay, so
Cindy's trying to try to come back. This is going to be the real suspense of the evening. Will it work? Will it not? Who knows? But thank you all for checking in on us. Hey, look, it works. There she is.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
That was amazing. Thank you both so much.
Thank
it's
you.
Always great to hear your perspective and kind of the behind the scenes. I've read and loved both of your books. And
thank you.
As you can see, you've got some fans on here that are already looking for book number 3. So that's exciting. And you know we want to have you back for that one too.
And I want to be back for that one. And I just want to say to everybody, Cindy and Book Club on the Go is the absolute best. If you live in Connecticut, they actually will deliver books to you if you're in a certain region. So look on their website for that information. She throws the best events. And we were supposed to have this event in person, but then there was this thing called coronavirus. So thank you, Cindy, for turning this virtual so that we could still do this.
Oh, thank you so much. Obviously, you see that I'm a little better in person, but I'm going to work on it. And
this was great.
John, for being such incredible moderator, as always.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. So I have to ask, you showed us the drink before, but where's it at now?
Oh, yeah. What's in it?
Where is the drink? Oh, is it back there? Oh, there it is.
Oh, I'm impressed. I thought it was going to be an empty glass.
Well,
what's in
there
it?
could have been a refill.
What's in it, Cindy?
You know what? Maybe I'll post the recipe. There's
Yes.
definitely Tito's and Cointreau and lemon juice, and I'll have to look up the rest of the recipe. But
Okay.
maybe I'll post it with a little picture.
Yes, do it.
Great idea.
Excellent. I'm going to sign off so I don't mess anything up, and then I'll let you guys finish. Thank you. Thank you to all of our attendees. So nice to kind of see you. We've missed you at real live events. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.